Hello, Valentina.
Hello, Evelina. How are you?
I'm very good. Hello, everyone who's listening, and welcome to our very special episode of Insights with Elite Mind Academy, because today we are focusing on anxiety. And as this week is Mental Health Awareness Week, with this year's theme being anxiety, it is such an important topic to discuss. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, those are weekly live conversations between me and Valentina, where we are discussing variety of topics in organizational well-being, and usually touching on themes that usually stay behind the closed doors. So this episode is a little bit different because we are really building on the theme of Mental Health Awareness Week, and we'll be exploring what is anxiety and why some of the common approaches to it are not necessarily helpful for our health and well-being, and what can be done about this. So Valentina, what are your thoughts? What would you like to start with by introducing some of the topic?
Absolutely. Well, I think just to kind of get a bit of an overview of actually how prevalent anxiety is would be useful, because we all know that depression and anxiety are kind of the most common experiences of poor mental health. But when we think about that in the work context, that's 3.7 million working days lost each year just because of work-related stress, anxiety, and depression. That costs around £28 billion every year. And when we look at those people who do experience that kind of stress and anxiety at work, there's a huge proportion would say that their anxiety is related to work. And in fact, 76% of employees report moderate to high or high levels of stress in the workplace. And so I think that's quite a significant number when we're looking at kind of the overall theme of anxiety. Yes, of course, there are things in our personal lives that could trigger that anxiety as well, but work can be a really big contributor to it. It can also be a big contributor to reducing that anxiety and helping channel that anxiety. And in fact, 54% of employees also agreed that the perfect amount of stress actually enables them to thrive. So I think that's really useful to know, because we often think of anxiety and stress as these automatic bad things, but there's a very important purpose for them, and there's a reason, an evolutionary reason, that we have these experiences, but we do just need to understand them a little bit better so that we can utilize them to their best advantage rather than them becoming debilitating.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really summarizing our approach to how we approach health and well-being at work, right? Because there is this difference between individual and their own responsibility and their own kind of internal way of looking after themselves, but then there is a role of environment and what happens to that individual when they are placed in, let's say, toxic working conditions, where in whatever environments that we are operate, what is the relationship between now this nervous system of this individual and this wider ecosystemic context in which we operate. And you rightly point out that, again, anxiety and stress and a lot of those fears and phobias and all of those emotions, they all have evolutionary baggage to it. And I truly believe that a lot of mental health issues are created, or kind of not necessarily created, but they are as a result of us living life, and the way we live and the way we work is just so far away from how we have evolved to thrive as human beings over millions of years, right? So we really have to take that into consideration, and we really understand of those kind of inner processes of our mind, brain, and body, and how we have been designed by evolution to be healthy, to perform at our best, to feel happy. Then we can take practical steps to build that internal self-regulation, but then also we can create healthier environments, right? We can change the way we work. We can restructure even our offices and our physical space around us, because we have that great understanding what is right for us. And that's really missing. So yeah, so let's start with that. So yeah, so Valentina, you already touched on the differences between kind of normal anxiety that we are all experiencing, and then again we have clinical aspects of anxiety and kind of like these diagnosed generalized anxiety disorders. We have all of the other range of disorders. Well, I cringe saying that word. I really don't like assigning disorders to any kind of anxiety and so on. But again, we have OCD, we have phobias, we have some of the other panic disorders, and all of those really unpleasant experiences, and all of these symptoms that do cause a lot of trouble and a lot of um, struggles for people in life. So what is the difference, and and why it is important?
Absolutely. So when we're looking at anxiety in particular and stress, and they are different things, but if we're thinking about them kind of in a package, two ways that we can assess whether it's reasonable and useful can be looking at the time period over which we experience it. So if we're experiencing a kind of general background sense of stress and anxiety, that's a lot more problematic than if we experience acute periods of stress or anxiety that are related to a particular circumstance. And that's the other side of it, is the trigger. Is it reasonable as a response to a trigger, or is it out of proportion and unreasonable? Because if it's reasonable, then there are lots of processes that the stress kind of start or shift in our bodies and minds that actually make us more able to handle a potentially difficult, stressful situation. Kind of obviously there's lots of different types, but in terms of kind of how things shift in our body, we are then more able to act in a kind of a fashion that might address it. I mean, I'll kind of maybe let you explain a little bit more of the neuroscience behind that, Evelina, because I know that that's more your background.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because, definitely when we look at, it's definitely very important, even like the differences between good and bad stress, right? There are like three things that I usually say that differentiates whether stress is actually good or bad for us. And that's how often and for how long we do get stressed and elevate that, sympathetic nervous system. Then when we do get stressed and anxious, to what extent do we activate that system, right? And if you're, let's say, if you, and this is going to that point, like what is reasonable, right? If you're going on stage to give important presentation, it's actually good to feel a little bit of those, nerves, because it really increases your blood flow to your prefrontal cortex. It really makes all of your senses sharper. It makes you respond to things in a better way. And you need that for that performance. But if you push it too far, now parts of your brain start to shut down, and it goes into this kind of self-preservation mode where you think I'm dying, and therefore parts of your body start to shut down, and now that is not helpful. Now your mind goes blank. You might even blank. Your responses are instead of kind of fighting and winning, you are now retracting and kind of dying and trying to survive, and your body responds, the whole neurobiology of it is very different. So that second process is to what extent do we activate that part. And then third is when the stressful period has ended, to what extent we are, how quickly we are then able to switch it off, and what is the quality of our rest and repair. And this is pretty much also about kind of time, how much we spend worrying about certain things, right? An example that I like to use is if somebody is, let's say, planning to jump with a parachute, there will be people who will be stressing about this for weeks before, and they will still be still highly stressed for weeks after because of what happened, and just thinking about it will make them anxious. But there will be other people who will be absolutely calm and composed up to the moment where they have to jump out of the plane, and then the moment they land, and the moment they pack their parachutes back, they calm, and they're able to really regulate their response based on what's happening, and like you say, what's reasonable given my current threat of danger right here and now. And I think here other important thing is probably to differentiate is, again, the difference between stress and anxiety, and maybe even fear, right? Because when we look at this, they're all very closely linked, and very often we put them in the same bucket and we think, I'm anxious, but actually maybe I'm stressed, and maybe I'm just afraid. So what's the difference? So when we look at fear, I'll start with fear because it's probably kind of the easiest thing. It's an emotional response to real or most of the time to real danger, right? So it's an emotional response to real or imagined threat. When we look at stress, now stress is a physical neurobiological reaction to that real or imagined danger. And when we look at anxiety, now it's much more taken out of proportion, and it's combining both physical and emotional responses, but it's mainly due to anticipation of that threat. And most of the time, it's not even real, right? Or it's not happening here and now. So when we look at fear and stress and all of those emotions, they have evolved to respond to a current threats. And yet, because of how our brain has evolved, and we've evolved this wonderful neocortex that allows us to imagine new things and create new possibilities. What this also means that it allows us to create some of those scenarios in our heads that now our older parts of our brain cannot differentiate whether that's real or whether that's imagined. So our body will still respond in exactly the same way, and will activate exactly the same neurobiological processes that have evolved for us to, fight predators in a savanna. We're still activating exactly the same things by, laying awake at night thinking about the mortgage and bills to pay and some of the business targets and so on. So it's very important to understand the difference and know that actually, those are different things, and they are the emotions, the physical response. And again, when we think about the chronic anxiety, right, it's chronically elevated sympathetic nervous system, our kind of fight flight response. But the reasons why that's activated can be a really range of influences, both internal, from your body balance, from your even nutrition, from your gut health, from dysregulated kind of wider autonomic nervous system, the health of your vagus nerve, and all of that. And then the external environments, the pressure, the lack of support, the physical spaces in which we are placing ourselves, the certainty and autonomy that we have. So it would be great to explore those kind of two aspects from that perspective.
Certainly. And I think you've touched on something really useful there, and that's about recognizing the difference between responding to something that's happening in our real world and responding to something that we're creating in our mind, because I think that can be a very useful point to help people recognize when their anxiety is relevant and useful now, or when the stress response is relevant and useful now, and when it's not useful. So in this kind of anticipating anxiety or this anticipated stress, we are responding to what's happening in these imagined scenarios. And Dr. Sonia, thank you, in the comments, you said that kind of much of the dis-ease of the mind is due to an inability to shut off that autopilot ego.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's exactly it, is that, if we're responding on that autopilot stress response to every kind of potentially nerve inducing scenario that we imagine in our minds, then we are of course going to have an elevated stress response and sympathetic nervous system being overactive, because we're not recognizing when we need to shut off that anxiety and shut off that kind of response, because it's not useful, it's not relevant to the here and now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so true about this kind of inability to switch off and shut off some of those kind of automatic responses. And again, I think this is also, some of our kind of common societal beliefs, and the way we live our lives is to blame, because we say that we are these kind of rational, intelligent human beings. We are able to make choices at will, and in reality, we are creatures of habit, right? Most of our habits, behaviors, and responses are really subconscious. And some of those processes are driven by these reptilian, mammalian, limbic parts of our brains that have evolved 300 million years ago, right? So when we look at that, we still have that's how old our autonomic nervous system is. So of course it's very well perfected machine that you have a trigger, and now it goes on this autopilot, as Sonia says. And because the way we live, we are not aware of how that system evolved and to what triggers it responds. We are building our environments in a way that is actually constantly triggering it. And we are not training our brains and bodies enough to self-regulate. So I wrote this article about myths of anxiety in HR's own magazine. We can post the link in a chat as well for those who want to read a little bit more about this. But there, I received a lot of feedback that I put this formula about what creates anxiety and what creates experience of anxiety. And there I wrote about the fact that anxiety is a combination of poor self-regulation skills, so your kind of internal mechanisms and how you kind of regulate yourself, placed in a high pressure external environment, right? When you combine those two, that's already recipe for anxiety, right? But of course, sometimes it can be only one, sometimes it can be only other aspect of those. But it's very important to recognize those internal and external aspects. So yeah, maybe that would be interesting way to kind of unpack it, right? So Valentina, if we look at internal aspects of that self-regulation and the way we all of that kind of contributing factors from internal neurobiological point of view that contributes to us having that anxiety, what are they? What are some of these main building blocks?
Certainly. So the biggest one really is an inability to recognize that we are not our thoughts, and to have that space between the trigger and the response. If we can cultivate a practice of mindfulness, and this doesn't just have to be kind of doing 10 minutes of a meditation every day, this is can be a bit more about actually grounding in the present moment instead of allowing ourselves to run off with thoughts. So when we notice that we've kind of been lost in thought and we've not been present in what we're doing or saying, or an inability to concentrate, and a lack of awareness of what's happening around us, then trying to find a prompt that will bring us back into the moment, because that helps us recognize that we are not our thoughts. And if it's our thoughts and these imagined scenarios that are often triggering anxieties, being able to step outside of that and into an observer role where we can see what our thought is that is potentially anxiety or stress inducing, then we have the space to choose how we respond to it. And that's really where the difference lies with that self-regulation. Because if we don't have that space and we immediately react just to the emotion of the thought, then we're lost in the anxiety and the stress response, and we become disempowered. Whereas when we can have that distance and we can observe the thought, we can then kind of take a secondary approach or judgment and ask ourselves, okay, what is useful? How do I want to respond to this? Do I want to respond to it with action to solve the problem? Is it something that's in my control? And if so, what is the action that's related to it? If it's out of my control, it's probably better spending your time working on acceptance and kind of managing your emotional response to this thing. So yeah, kind of focusing on trying to give yourself a gap between the trigger and the response will really, really benefit for that self-regulation.
Yeah. So we from neuroscience point of view, there are these kind of 3 different ways to build our kind of self-regulation and to kind of self-regulate ourselves. And this, what you refer to, is this is so-called like top-down approach, where we can regulate our bodies, our brains through logic and reason, and being able to kind of insert that wedge between the trigger and response through, practice of mindfulness, and being able to be here and now, and be grounded and connected. And there's a lot of other approaches, such as visualizations, where can really help us to build that perspective from kind of cognitive point of view. Then there are some other approaches, which is, let's say, which is the opposite, would be a bottom up, which would be through the body. And here is also very, very important to recognize that, again, like, we are not our thoughts, and anxiety is not necessarily created just by thought processes alone. Our head is connected with the body, and there is nervous system, there is all of the hormonal, communication channels, there is all of this kind of ecosystem within ourselves that we have, that also contributes to that balance. And very often, let's say, dysregulation of autonomic nervous system, which can be a cause of that chronic anxiety, and kind of more of a kind of to clinical symptoms level, can be also caused by unhealthy gut microbiome. It can also be caused by our hormonal imbalances. So again, when we think about women approaching the perimenopause, 42% of women are actually being prescribed antidepressants because they have very strong symptoms of anxiety, of depression, and so on, because our hormones play a huge role in our ability to regulate our nervous system responses, right? So there are a lot of other things, let's say there are specific minerals and nutrients that are missing in our body, such as magnesium, for example, which plays a crucial role in communication between, neuronal cells, and this kind of nutrient transfer between cells in a body, that can also contribute to this. So I think it's very important to know that, yes, there are thought processes here, and we can learn how to control that. And also there is this bottom-up approach, where we need to know that, again, if you haven't slept, if you haven't eaten it right, of course you'll be much more irritable, you'll be triggered much easier, you will be looking for your body responds very differently to environment if we haven't got those basics of good sleep, good diet, good amount of energy, from exercise, and so on. And then the third aspect is outside in. So here it's how we are regulating ourselves through our environment. And think about, for example, how, looking at the sunset when you are at the beach, how it makes you feel. How listening to different pieces of music, how it evokes different emotional responses in us. How we feel differently when we are in a space, in our own physical space of our own home, and how we feel differently in specific different environments. Why surrounding ourselves with certain people energizes us, and then some other people drain us, right? So it's all of these kind of external influences that also contribute to that. So when we look at all of those three ways of building our resilience and our ability to kind of regain control over this anxiety, what we are really doing, we're building 3 abilities. We're building our self-awareness, right? So understanding everything that's happening in our mind, brain, body, like physically, and knowing like our triggers and our environment, and like really understanding ourselves. Then second aspect is self-regulation. So okay, now I know, now I recognize this feeling. How can I regulate my emotions, my level of stress? How can I regulate my impulses, my cravings, my behaviors? And then self-expression. So what is my healthy outlet? What is my way of expressing my emotions, my stress, my feelings? How, what is the healthy way of expressing even my thoughts in a way that help me to, you know, receive some help, and so on. So yeah, so we're looking at this kind of three approaches for self-regulation, and this capacity that we can build for self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-expression.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important that you've highlighted there that we can't kind of always logic ourselves out of anxiety. And thank you, Jacinta, also for your comment about we are creatures of habit, not logic. And I think that's so important because a lot of the time people who are experiencing anxiety, and especially people who experience generalized anxiety disorder or general anxiety, will have a predisposition to remain in this cognitive space and to remain in this logical space and think that, you know, when we try to engage in any kind of problem solving, we do it through that logical, analytical space. And that can really worsen the whole experience if we just remain in the head, because we are disconnecting more and more from the present moment and from our bodies. And
we end up overthinking. And again, you know, like you said about this kind of problem solving, we can take it to the other end, and we are now imagining all the worst case scenarios, and we are constructing all of the what if scenarios. And that's really what defines anxiety, right? What if. And allowing ourselves to experience it physically, somatically, emotionally, as if it is real, when actually it's really a social kind of cognitive construct in many ways.
absolutely. And so kind of when we are experiencing anxiety, a lot of the time we can then start trying to figure out and come up with solutions to our anxiety in our heads and overthinking the anxiety and feeling anxious about the anxiety itself, which is actually also what can often lead to panic attacks. And so actually coming back to the body and coming back to our habits, as you rightly mentioned, Jacinta, can be a really useful way to start tackling a more general anxiety, that kind of GAD type diagnosis. And you mentioned exercise and meditation. So these are both things that kind of draw us into the present moment and connect us with our bodies. But also, especially with exercise, we'll be stimulating hormones that kind of help relieve anxiety and also help us to kind of get rid of excess energy and have kind of regulate our dopamine levels and things like that as well. So finding habits that work for you, that you know help with, or that take you into a calmer state. That doesn't have to be exercise, it doesn't have to be meditation. Often it's activities or hobbies which allow you to get into a state of flow, whereby you're not thinking in a conscious way, you're very much in the moment, you're kind of having this flow of expression from inside to out, but also kind of connecting with the present moment. Often it's things that are creative, so things like art, drawing, creating music, writing, things like that. But also something that can be quite useful is recognizing, exactly like you say, Evelina, what can we influence about our environment that to help us kind of influence our moods and influence our states. And something that I personally do that I find really useful, and I wonder if anyone else does this. I mean, I think this is also very much a kind of, because I live in London, it's something to do in the city, because it's essentially listening to birdsong. And the reason this is helpful is because over thousands of years, people have come to recognize that when we can hear birds singing, generally things are okay. It's when birds stop singing and we don't hear nature and we don't hear that natural life around us, that's a a trigger or a flag to say something might be wrong.
Sign of worry, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so even things like that. So in the morning, we get this boost of cortisol to help clear out melatonin and to kind of kickstart our day. But that can also feel quite stressful in the morning when you wake up and you have this flood of cortisol in your body. So I often wake up and immediately I'll put birdsong on, because it also mimics what we would be naturally hearing if we weren't living in a city. We're living kind of closer to wildlife. And the more closely we can live in alignment with how our bodies and our brains have evolved, the less likely we are to experience these kind of out of proportion
Imbalances, right? Because I think we live so so out of sync with ourselves, with our bodies, with our environments, with nature. And because we're not even aware of the impact of all of this, that we end up focusing on performance and productivity and some other other targets that really are very much stress and anxiety inducing. So that awareness is crucial, and understanding what this really means. And yeah, Rob was saying as well, like bird song is actually in coming from your from your side, Valentina, there, as you probably sat there with windows wide open to your garden, and it's so beautiful to hear that in the background, as you're talking about that. Damir also commented that anxiety and panic attacks are based on our heart. So I think it's very important to definitely recognize this intrinsic link between our cardiovascular system and our nervous system. And again, those processes are so closely linked that, again, if you think about how the system has evolved to operate to keep us safe over millions of years, think about you being attacked by a lion, okay, in a savannah. Okay, let's make a you go for milk to the corner shop and the lion jumps out on you. Right, what will you do? Right, so there are things that our body has evolved to protect ourselves, and this fight, flight, and freeze responses are there to help save our lives. And if those mechanisms weren't there, we wouldn't be here today, right? So the primary response is always fight or flight, because you'll either try to run away or you'll try to fight the obstacle there. And in order for you to fight that kind of size of the threat, there are a lot of processes, neurobiological processes in our body that have to reflect that. And one of them is what happens to our blood flow. And literally, the direction of the blood is redirected to very different parts of our body. So blood flow is redirected away from internal organs to stop the digestion, to stop any of the internal organs, and this is again to stop wasting energy on digestion, but also it stops that in case, let's say, your guts get open, it also stops risks from bleeding and so on. So all of the blood flow is actually redirected to your muscles, and it also goes away from the skin. So you have this completely different change of how blood is circulating around your body, and it goes away from your internal organs into muscles, and it goes away from your surface of the skin into muscles. That's why people become pale and sweaty. And then also, based on the level of threat, the blood flow within different areas of the brain is also changes. If we are there to fight, the blood flows to our prefrontal cortex, and it has this kind of narrow focused view on the threat, and it makes our senses sharper. It makes kind of slows down the time to give us to really give that edge over that performance. But if you take it too far, then blood flow is actually taken away from the brain, because brain is one of the most energy consuming organs, right? And the moment that happens, your body starts to shut down as if I'm now dying. And it really helps to kind of like, protect yourself. We protect all of the vulnerable areas of your neck, of our stomach, genitals, like all of these kind of parts that can save our lives. And again, we adapt that posture. Our shoulders come high, we crouch, we slouch, we, all of those things, which completely also changes our breathing, right? So we end up breathing from this kind of high level apical breathing to kind of access this quick level of energy in our bloodstream. So again, if you are fighting, you need a lot of energy. So all of your cells get depleted into the bloodstream. So your sugar levels rise because you need that energy to fight, right? So absolutely, that's where the role of the heart comes in, right? The whole cardiovascular system, it's intrinsically linked to all of these processes that need for us to fight or flight in the moment. When it gets to freeze part, now this is where it goes completely over the top of the sympathetic nervous system, and your body starts to shut down, and eventually it goes back completely to parasympathetic nervous system. This is where people, for example, faint, right? Where the level of pressure and stress is too far, to the point that your body cannot cope anymore, and it switches off completely to the baseline, because we are built to restore. And again, some of those kind of fainting mechanisms, this is exactly the same as some animals who play dead. It's exactly the same, right? They don't just pretend to be dead. They actually, their whole neurobiology is really switching off to that complete parasympathetic nervous system, where it's switched off completely. So you are so limp and so relaxed that you will, any predators would think that you are dead. So again, it's these really, really powerful evolutionary mechanisms that are happening in our body. And if we are not aware of it, we can't do anything about it. It's just the roller coaster of the threat that happens. And some of those threats are, again, cognitive. We are thinking, worrying something about something that happened yesterday. We're stressing about something that will happen tomorrow. And yet exactly the same processes are being activated that have evolved for us to fight real threats. So yeah, it's so crucial to understand what's happening in our body, so we can really kind of rebuild that health from inside out.
Certainly. And I think for me, something that's been useful and something I've recommended to clients as well is just a very simple way to kind of shift what's going on in our bodies. Is like you say, often it all comes down to the breath. And that's sometimes one of the first things that we can notice when we're feeling anxiety or when we're moving towards panic attack, is that we're breathing up in this upper portion of the chest, and we're often emphasizing, or we're kind of doing a lot of short, sharp inhales. And if we're trying to take a bottom up approach to regulating our anxiety, you can Google all sorts of breathing exercises, and I would encourage people to look into them. Sometimes they can be quite complex and difficult to remember, and you don't necessarily always have, you're not in the space to be doing that when you're verging on a panic attack. So just a very simple thing that I encourage people to remember is, if you feel yourself getting into that kind of high chest breathing, is to just work on breathing deeper into your lungs, but also slowly trying to make your exhales longer than your inhales, and overall lengthening your breath generally. So for example, if you're noticing that you're inhaling for 2 counts or 3 counts and exhaling maybe just for 1 or 2, try and shift that so you still inhale for 3, but you're exhaling for then 3 or 4, and try and lengthen that and lengthen that and lengthen that. And it might take some time, especially if you're in quite an anxious or aggravated state, but really focus on it, because it won't not work. If you are doing this, it will shift things in your body. So if you can lengthen that to, say, inhaling for 4 or 5 and exhaling for 6 or 7, then you will start to shift into the parasympathetic nervous system. It will really help you calm down.
Absolutely. And the reason why it works is that our body is constantly in this balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And we know that sympathetic nervous system is that stress response, that fight flight response. So very often it's said like, oh, then that sympathetic nervous system is a baddie one. That's the one that's causing all of these health issues and so on. But that's not the case. It's the balance between the two that we need to restore, because we need both of them, right? So sympathetic nervous system is it's like your accelerator for your car, right? It's something that keeps you going, something that gives you energy, that gets you into action. Parasympathetic nervous system is your brakes. It's something that will help you to slow down, to adjust the pace, to stop where it's needed, and take right action according to those conditions around you. And everything in your body is a balance between the two, right? So even like your heart, your heart, it's when it compresses, it's your sympathetic nervous system. When it relaxes, it's parasympathetic nervous system. So every beat is already pulsation of that, and that's how heart rate variability monitors operate, to kind of monitor your frequency of resilience, even from that perspective, if you want to look up at like heart maths, for example. But also when you look at breathing, inhale is your sympathetic nervous system. Exhale is your parasympathetic nervous system. So like you said, when we are getting anxious and our sympathetic nervous system gets overactive, we are having this inhale, and we can induce panic attacks simply by breathing this way, right? So when people are having that panic attack, they are inhaling, they can't, and somebody says breathe, they're breathing too much, they're inhaling too much. The fact is that they're not exhaling is the problem, right? So these approaches, like let's say 4 to 8 breathing, is really, really useful, because you then count your breath and you say you inhale for 4, you exhale for 4, but then with every exhale you add additional number. So you keep inhales the same, but you then adding another number until ideally your exhale becomes twice as long. So you go for 4 in, 4 out, 4 in, 5 out, 4 in, 6 out, and 7, and then 8 out. And the moment your exhale is twice as long, your body will shift back into parasympathetic nervous system, and you will switch off your panic attack, right? These things we should be teaching at schools, right? Not giving the diagnostic list of symptoms of what anxiety is, because how helpful is that, right? We really need to be teaching people how to self-regulate. And I know there's been some comments, and I know there Alex as well pointed this very important differentiation between what is the kind of like clinical symptoms and let's say generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorders, and just kind of like normal aspects of being anxious, which is again part of being human. It's part of our stress response. It is so crucial to understand that even when we have those clinical symptoms, there are causes and reasons for that. And while medication has a place, and sometimes we need a relief, because again, if you can't get out of your house because you are, if that is stopping you from leaving your house, if panic and anxiety attacks and OCD stop living your life, if it stops you from doing things you love, then of course we need that help. We need that relief immediately, and medication has place. But I would still encourage everyone, whether you have diagnosis or not, to always go back to this state of what makes us human and how can we actually restore that system. So any kind of medical relief supposed to be a temporary, so that we give our bodies better chances to then go back and reflect and restore and rebuild our internal processes there.
Absolutely. I think it can be, useful as well to, workplaces at the moment, often they are responding to Mental Health Awareness Week and sending out various comms and things like that to kind of address this topic of anxiety. And I've had a few sent to me, bad examples, where the officers are just saying, anxiety, that's the topic of Mental Health Awareness Week. Come and talk to us if you're experiencing anxiety. We really care about your experience of anxiety. something like that, without including just some of these basic tips and tools. So if you are an organizational or HR professional listening to this, please do bear this in mind, that it's these simple tools that should be taught in schools, as you say, Evelina, and should be part of our kind of our national education. Those are the things that are actually really useful to start communicating en masse to employees, rather than communicating things like, you know, about the company identity or brand identity. You know, we support people with anxiety, or here's the information for the employee assistance program. Actually communicating these basic tools about how to self-regulate is much, much more useful. You can still include
much more effective, absolutely. And I think to that point, what is also very important to realize that we cannot also, you know, as much as I'm kind of a big promoter for this kind of neuroscience brain-based approaches and really going back to how our minds and bodies have evolved, we cannot dismiss people suffering, right? And where employees come to you and say, I'm suffering with this anxiety, and these meetings or these circumstances at work are actually a great cause of stress to me, we cannot say, oh yeah, that's just anxiety, let's just talk about it, it's normal, you know, everyone has anxiety. We really have to understand that yes, there is anxiety and there is anxiety, right? We really cannot dismiss people's level of suffering, and we need to give them practical tools, even though those tools incorporate all of these natural approaches of how our mind and body have evolved. Thank you, Robbie, for your comments, and I think this is really, there's been a lot of discussions in the chat around, you know, I think my outlook to mental health is very different, because I'm often speaking, I'm not going to say against, but it can appear as such, you know, some of the kind of traditional medical approaches. I'm not necessarily against medication. I'm not against diagnostic labels. I'm not against the traditional medical approach. However, what I am trying to put the message out there, that these traditional methods and approaches has limitations, and in the modern society we are not looking broad and wide enough, and we're saying CBT is the most evidence-based approach, so we'll put that as a solution for all, and we will be blind to the fact that, you know what, there is a huge proportion of people to whom this doesn't work, right? And there are huge number of population to whom this traditional access to, you know, public healthcare and some of these traditional approaches, they are either inaccessible based on where they live, or, you know, what resources, and, you know, like access to postcode will define the access to your health resources, right? So to many people, this traditional healthcare is not accessible. To other people, it's ineffective, right? And you can show me all, I'm qualified psychologist, I know all of the evidence behind the CBT, and I know the power of this, and I know the statistics, and I don't take that for granted, right? I'm aware of that. But when we look at the effectiveness of that, we also have to take equally seriously other people who are not being touched by that, right? Who do not find that effective. And this is, to me, that's the reason why I do what I do. Because I, you know, if let's say you're happy with your medical approach, you're happy taking medication for the rest of your life, if you're happy, you know, going to therapy for 10 years and you are happy, you know, with that clinical model approach, well, great, it works for you. I have no place in that, right? It's great because that works for you. Let's celebrate that. I am concerned with the people for whom that doesn't work, and the fact that we are not placing wider importance on the fact that every individual is unique, and we are not being looking at mental health system in a wide and holistic perspective to understand what are the human needs of this person and how can we empower them to make their own choices, to make their own decisions, and to actually recover instead of being dependent on something or someone else, right? Whether that's medication or therapy. When somebody tells me that they've been in therapy for 10, 15 years, I think this is wrong. Then this is the industry profiting from someone else's suffering, right? We really need to look into wider economic perspective, the ecosystemic approach, like how we have even created those illnesses through our society, through the way we live, through the way we work, how can we address that, right? So yeah, I just wanted to put it out there because I know that some of those messages that I put out there can create some conflict. And I acknowledge that. I hear you. And there is a place for medication. There is place for CBT. There is place for all of that. But we have to think broader. We need to look at all of those approaches as just one of the approaches that are available in the wider range of all the human needs.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important to kind of takeaway as the takeaway message from this. It's about just opening our minds to also some other ways to deal with anxiety symptoms and stress symptoms. And one of those is, taking this holistic approach of looking at how our environments can be influencing these symptoms as well. And, coming back to the workplace and experiencing stress, negative stress, not the kind of useful, productive stress, experiencing negative stress in the workplace. 76% of employees cite workload as the main cause for negative stress at work. And that's huge. I mean, it's a 3% rise from, it says, 3% reduction from 2022, but it's still a very, very high proportion. After that, we have lack of control at around 31% and lack of support, 29%. But that high workload is a really, really big part of it. And obviously that lack of control and lack of support play into that a lot. So for workplaces to start recognizing that a high workload is a big, big cause of work-related stress is really useful. And so then you can put in systems in place for greater support, better automation of certain processes, better kind of boundaries around workload. All of these are things that can help people manage stress, work-related stress. Because it's not just about the individual and then the individual saying, I am anxious, I am the
I am depressed, I am anxious, and it becomes part of your identity, part of what defines who you are and your experience in life, right? And your relationship with work.
And if we say instead, I am feeling anxiety or I'm experiencing anxiety, then we start to place that outside of just the individual. And it means that we can look at it from a wider perspective of all of the other things that are influencing it and all of the possible things that can influence it positively as well. And we see it as transient rather than this integral state of being.
Absolutely. I feel rather than I am. And I think that's my approach to a lot of kind of these diagnostic labels. And again, and some of my approach has been, and some of the attitudes to the mental health, and this is kind of a bit of a public disclaimer that I'm going to say, some of my attitudes to mental health have been shaped by the fact that I have worked in a therapeutic practice with people who didn't have access or who found ineffective those traditional medical routes. They found either ineffective or sometimes it made them feel worse, right? So I worked with people who have multiple diagnostic labels, people who have psychosomatic illnesses and they go to doctors and nobody finds anything wrong, people who have unaddressed traumas that sometimes they're not even aware of, that comes out in variety of those symptoms, people who've been on antidepressants since 1993 and nobody has even reassessed them, right? So when you are working in that environment and when you see day in and out and again people being failed by that healthcare, people being failed by the system, I cannot not do anything about this, right? So yes, that medical approach has space and we have to recognize this, but we also have to recognize this kind of wider approach to this and look at how can we tackle this. And when we look at approaches, some of the approaches to mental health and the way, like Valentina, now we are working, with businesses to create those healthier working environments. We're really looking at the holistic view, and for example, assessing other systems within the business that then allow people to have more time for themselves. And if I can give you like very simple little example, let's say a company like Screwfix, they have an amazing system to track their stock, right? A lot of other retail organizations are still counting their stock manually, right? They will count their products and so on. They actually have a system where they just scan all of the, each pack of their little nails or screws or whatever. But what this means that by automating that process, you have now created much more space for people to be human. So they will spend extra time communicating with their customers. They will spend extra time speaking with their employees and with their managers and doing some other human bits that cannot be automated and replaced by any other, AI or other technology out there. So when we think about mental health ecosystem, we have to consider all of it, right? It's not just about talking about mental health and medicating your symptoms. We have to really think in the wider ecosystem of how we live, how we work, what are the processes that are supporting us to embed self-care in our daily life, to build those right supportive relationships. What are the lines of communication and reporting that we are creating in this line? How does the training and development reflect, some of our education that, yes, some of the comments here as well about, things like breathing supposed to be taught at schools, but it isn't. So can we then use workplaces to bring some of those resources and to kind of cover those gaps in education? So we really need to look in a much, much broader perspective and understand that everything has time and place, and no tool or technique or approach, whether that's medical, whether that's not medical, everything from medication to crystal healing has its own place, right? But we really need to look at deeper at human needs and how we have evolved to operate, and find a way to build these supportive ecosystems that allow people to thrive rather than causing all of those disorders and disabilities that we then give labels to people and say, that's your fault. Now this is who you are. Now you are depressed. You are schizophrenic. You are bipolar, right? Let's look 10 steps before that and look at what are the systems and processes that need to be corrected in our society to prevent this from happening in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think that's a useful kind of point to round off on, really, and to kind of just prompt us to look at the bigger picture of anxiety and not just kind of hone in and focus on what the individual is experiencing, or kind of blame an individual, but to look at the big picture and how we can support in that holistic way.
Absolutely. And also it's very important to know the boundaries. What is responsibility of the individual and what is in their control? What is the responsibility of the environment to then create that supportive ecosystem and not cause the harm? And where are the boundaries of employers should end, and where external expertise by the expert is needed? Because we cannot expect managers to become therapists as well. So really having these kind of 3 areas of responsibility and know how to direct people to the right support and how to build this individual resilience, how to build the wider ecosystem of support, and how, where, and when we direct to the right professionals, and how we connect all of that in a feedback loop so we can constantly grow and learn and improve and always do better. And again, evolve. Talking about that concept of evolution. So thank you to everyone who's listening. Thank you so much for all of your wonderful comments and thoughts. It's been really, really engaging conversation. It's been really interesting to read your comments. Feel free to send us any other questions, suggestions, share your experiences, your thoughts, and we are looking forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place. See you next Thursday for our next episode of Insights with Elite Mind Academy. Bye there.
Bye. Thank you very much.